Sarah, Duchess of York, never quite fitted the royal mould. Even the nickname Fergie persisted, reflecting her determination to remain herself. The flying lessons, the frequent skiing holidays, her appearance, and the design of the new home given to her by the Queen all excited comment and controversy. It had all started so well. A strong character, she was one of the most influential women to become Duchess of York. But as an adventurous contemporary woman with an independent outlook, her attitude and ideas didn't sit easily with the rigid protocol of royal life. Her clothes reflected a lack of judgment. Her overfamiliarity with the press raised eyebrows. She seemed extravagant with money and managed her own affairs badly. As a member of the royal family, the artificial constraints and strict scheduling of public life went against her own preference for spontaneity, enthusiasm, and easy laughter. For a while, Fergie was a breath of fresh air. But when the story broke that her marriage was on the rocks, it was amidst reports that she and Andrew were often heard shouting at each other behind the stuffy walls of Buckingham Palace. It was soon obvious that their relationship had moved beyond repair. Fergie had been crushed between a hostile press and a royal system that had failed to give support. Her need for company while her husband was away at sea had damaged her own reputation and reflected badly on the royal family. But what does royalty do when the wife wants out? Is the British monarchy itself under threat? In this democratic age, royalty has had to widen the circle of potential marriage partners to include commoners. But the Duke and Duchess are yet another example of an experiment that's failed. So where does a royal family go from here? Sarah Ferguson had seemed the perfect raw material for a royal consort, someone who embraced her new status with determination and enthusiasm. But somehow she fell foul of the media and the royal system. Where did it all go wrong? The British royal family is a tightly knit group with its own unique lifestyle. Its members are very wary of outsiders. But, like the previous Duchess of York, now the Queen Mother, Sarah Ferguson's entry into the ranks was welcomed. For them, Prince Andrew couldn't have chosen a better wife. They admired her sensible attitude and strong personality. The Queen immediately began referring to her as "my daughter." And the Queen Mother summed her up by saying she's so English, so free of all those airs and graces we can't stand. With an ancestry rooted in the land and services, her family background was also impeccable. The Queen had known the Fergusons for 3 decades and had watched this high-spirited redhead grow up. Sarah's enduring interest in horses, polo, and other country pursuits particularly endeared her to the Queen, and from the beginning they were often seen at equestrian events together. Horsemanship of any kind is a central interest for all the royal family. But when the press gets in the way, the Queen is not amused. The relationship between these two women was always very relaxed.
They're both outdoor, horsey, doggy sort of women. And the Queen also likes people with personality. And she finds Sarah an amusing companion. They get on very well, far better, in fact, than the Queen gets on with Diana, who she finds more difficult and a little more restrained when she's with her.
Fergie quickly became known as the Action Princess. Her mother had taught her to ride almost as soon as she could walk, and at a special fun day at Ascot, she gave an impressive public display of her own equestrian skills. But she was perhaps best known as the Flying Duchess. Determined to learn all she could about her husband's work as a naval helicopter pilot, Chatterbox 1, as she was dubbed by a traffic controller, was the first royal lady to get a pilot's license, and then took less time than her husband to win her wings for helicopters. As she herself explained, "I now know exactly what he's talking about when he comes home from a day's flying." But her most controversial activity was skiing. She was first put on skis when she was 4 years old, and it remained an obsession. But the Prince and Princess of Wales were also keen skiers. She rivals Charles in skill and speed, and both enjoyed competing on the slopes. For Fergie, skiing was a vital outlet for her energy and love of speed. She certainly outclassed Diana.
Don't you go anywhere.
Despite these joint holidays, Fergie's skiing exploits were singled out, and the sports image as the elite pastime of the jet set soon added fuel to the media's growing criticisms of her leisure pursuits. She was portrayed as a parasite, shirking her public responsibilities in favour of personal indulgence.
Because they're sort of so-called glamour sports, really. I mean, she once said to me, if only it was tennis, no one would mind, but because I want to go skiing, people feel that it's a glamorous thing and perhaps not something a duchess should be doing all the time. But I mean, other members of the royal family do it and don't get criticised. It seems that everything she does is open to criticism.
But her commitment to public duties seemed real enough. As a naval wife, she could have got away with only the occasional public appearance, but she took on a heavy schedule and launched into crowds with a bustling enthusiasm eager to make contact.
What's your name? Are you in charge of all these lovely ladies? Are they all your girlfriends? Yes, they are. Oh, well, he's Stephen. Oh, yeah, no, we're not the boys, the girls. Thank you very much. Is that for me? When you grow up, you're going to give your girlfriend lots of flowers.
No, why? I would.
What's your name? Thank you, Rachel. That's me. Thank you very much. Aren't I lucky? All your mummies are going to get cross.
Her early career in public relations stood her in good stead. Unlike Diana, she needed little coaching before being confident enough to go it alone. But this maturity created problems in itself.
The Duchess of York, who arrived in the royal family when she was quite mature, 25, 26, had been around the world, she didn't hitchhike, but she'd travelled widely the way lots of young women do, and to suddenly step inside this great institution, this machine that swallows people up and decides what they will do, must have been very, very difficult to adjust to, especially as, instead of having a sort of gentle introduction to it, she was dropped straight into it and she began doing a lot of official jobs almost immediately after the honeymoon.
At 26, she wanted to bring her own ideas to the job. As one departure from the norm, she chose to support Tracy Edwards and her all-woman crew for the Whitbread round-the-world race in 1989 with their yacht Maiden. She admired their courage and determination, and such a challenge appealed to her own sense of adventure. But one of the most unexpected and frustrating aspects of her new royal status was the sudden lack of personal money supply. She'd been used to earning her own living and spending her own cash.
If you want to go out for lunch with your girlfriends, you need £50 or something. Where is it going to come from? Well, the men in the Windsor family don't understand that because they don't go out for lunch like that. I mean, the Prince of Wales never goes out to restaurants that I know of for meals at all. Prince Andrew lives on a Navy base most of the time, works in Navy establishments. He doesn't pop out very often. Occasionally he takes his wife out for dinner somewhere at a nice restaurant, but that would be, the bill would be sent, or a policeman will pay with an American Express card or something. They just don't deal with money. So they can't understand why a woman would want to have some Reddies.
The irony was that despite this behind-the-scenes cash flow problem, Fergie was gaining a reputation for extravagance. Again, it was her skiing that gave rise to these accusations of being spendthrift.
She's probably not very wise with her money. But I mean, she doesn't have a great deal of it to be wise with. I mean, she's made money out of her writing, which she's perfectly entitled to do. And indeed, when she came into the family, when she first got engaged to Andrew, Prince Philip, actually said it's nice to have someone in this family that makes their own living. And then it seemed to be everything she did that was good to start with seemed to go against her.
Before Fergie became part of the royal family, she'd had a 4-year love affair with a millionaire entrepreneur from the Formula One racing world. Paddy McNally was still an enduring influence.
Paddy McNally was a sort of father figure to her, and he was the sort of man, he'd always tease her. He'd tease her about putting on weight, he'd tease her about eating chocolate, he'd tease her about her hair, he'd tease her about everything. And she loved him very much, actually. And but I'm sure their marriage would not have worked between them. I mean, he was 20 years older than her, but he was a sort of a rock for her, although he undermined her confidence tremendously by always having an eye for, you know, someone else, somebody younger and prettier. So he knocked her confidence. But he was there for her and is still there for her as a friend. And I respect the way he's never, ever said a word to anyone about his relationship with her. So there's got to be some good in him there.
Fergie's mother, Susan, filed for divorce in order to marry Argentinian polo player Hector Barrantes. 4 years later, Ronnie Ferguson also married again and started a new, much younger family. Fergie was fond of both her step-parents, and although newcomers to the royal family usually found their own relations pushed into the background, she was determined that none of hers would be left out. It helped that her father, Major Ferguson, was already Prince Charles's polo manager, and the increased press exposure soon made him into an internationally known media personality. Such notoriety had its flip side, though. In September 1988, stepmother Susan and Fergie were at Smith's Lawn to give public support at Major Ferguson's controversial departure. It was a brave show of solidarity for a crowing press. A ceremonial stick marked the end of his many years as deputy chairman of the Guards Polo Club, after tabloid newspapers revealed details of his visits to a massage parlour in London's West End. It was an emotional farewell under a cloud of scandal. The club committee had voted him out, and the message was clear. For the 57-year-old father of a royal duchess, it was a humiliating rejection. Despite pressures to distance herself, Fergie was there to give her support. For both of them, it was a case of putting on a stiff upper lip.
Whatever I can say, on behalf of all of us here, I personally feel it's a tragedy that you are leaving the club. And God willing, you will be back with us. You won't be polo, I know that. Ladies and gentlemen, I have a lump in my throat. 3 cheers for Major Ronnie! Hip hip! Hooray! Hip hip! Hooray! Hip hip! Hooray!
Fergie felt very responsible for what had happened and stuck by him throughout the ordeal.
I think that's one of the qualities I admire about her, her loyalty to her father and her sister when they have had unpleasant publicity. And I think she feels that if it weren't for me, they wouldn't be the focus of all this attention. Who would be going around checking up on her father or her sister if they weren't related to the Duchess of York? And so she feels that it's in a way her fault they've had these problems, and she would like to help them as much as she can. And so she stays very, very loyal and devoted to both of them.
But it was her relationship with Andrew that most interested the press. The prince had first been attracted by her lack of reverence towards him and enjoyed her no-nonsense attitude to life. To begin with, they seemed perfectly matched. As Fergie once said, "He's my main right arm. He's the one who gets me through." Their arrival in Cloisters for the wedding of friend and Swiss ski guide Bruno Sprecher brought the world's press to a private celebration. On a less happy occasion, this same man had saved Prince Charles's life during the avalanche that killed Major Hugh Lindsay. But the Yorks were still behaving like newlyweds themselves, and their own marriage's physical warmth was there for all to see.
I know how devoted she was to Andrew, how much in love they both were. I mean, to be with them sometimes is almost embarrassing. They were so, tactile, and they just couldn't leave each other alone. And it was something that made you feel quite warm and happy just to look at them. And I don't think that sort of thing goes away in a hurry.
This personal happiness also showed in their public duties. To begin with, they carried out a lot of official engagements together. Businesslike, but with their own brand of informality, they made a good team. Fergie seemed determined to make a go of her new life, and that included creating a new home. Sunning Hill Park, 5 miles down the road from Windsor Castle, is rumoured to have cost almost £5 million. It was the Queen's wedding present and took 4 years to complete. Incorporating staff quarters and nursery wing, plus swimming pool, tennis court and stables, the 50-room mansion looks more like a Texas ranch than a traditional English stately home, and was nicknamed Palace Dallas and South York by the press. Sarah's first pregnancy was a difficult one. She expanded from a size 12 to a size 16 and felt continually sick. With Andrew away at sea, she also had no husband by her side to comfort her and had to cope alone. But with the arrival of the Queen's 5th grandchild, Beatrice Elizabeth Mary, the discomfort and long wait seemed worthwhile. Born at 8:18 on the 8th day of the 8th month of the 88th year of the century, the new princess's timing, according to Chinese astrology, heralded great good fortune. "My daughter's gorgeous, but I'm biased," was the proud father's verdict, while her mother immediately nicknamed this new redhead Baby Beetroot. Even the press celebrated this latest royal addition. But Fergie as a mother was soon under attack. Andrew had to leave on a 6-month naval tour of duty to Australia immediately after the christening. Fergie soon flew out to join him, leaving behind her 6-week-old baby.
I think she was really dropped right in it, and she was floundering for a while, you know, especially after she had Beatrice and she went to Australia and left the baby for 6 weeks. People thought that was appalling. Now, the truth behind that story is that is what the Duke of York asked her to do. And she felt, as a good wife, and the fact that he'd been away from home for most of that year, she felt she owed it to him to give him her total undivided attention, you know, tender loving care, etc. He'd been home a very, very short time that year. And so she thought the baby wouldn't miss me. But basically she was putting a good face on it. I'm sure she didn't really want to leave the baby, but he wanted her to, and that's the main thing. And so that's what she did.
Back home, her public duties continued, her visits distinguished from those of other royals by a relaxed chat, even in the most formal surroundings. She'd mastered the fine art of small talk to total strangers. Determined to be professional, she hid a basic shyness behind a supremely confident manner.
No, thank you very much. Yeah. Well, I hope so too, yeah.
Often disregarding protocol, she relied heavily on her instincts to guide her, always trying to cover as many people as she could.
Better go.
Her transparent eagerness was frequently off-putting to those who expected a more reserved royal family, but she refused to become more aloof. As she said herself, "I'm not going to change, why should I?" But she seemed easily distracted if things bored her. Even during a long and tedious speech, a ladybird by her feet should have been ignored. But she couldn't seem to leave it alone and keep her attention on the job in hand. It was a telling episode. If there was a charm school for moulding royal duchesses, this was one pupil who'd failed to conform to the straitjacket of royal caution. Fergie's girlish exuberance persisted. It was a straightforwardness at odds with the carefully structured and often monotonous nature of royal duties. Such non-royal behaviour had been excusable in the beginning, but her learning curve seemed to have taken a wayward turn when it came to patience and standing still on parade. But when a bit of action was required, she was in her element. Audience participation was what she was good at, and if some balloons needed to be cut loose, she would wrestle with the wind and wield the scissors with enthusiasm to get them airborne.
It's like a children's party.
The press were becoming more and more critical of her excitable behaviour, and her lack of decorum generated an air of disrespect at ground level too. One awkward situation occurred when she was taken past Wormwood Scrubbs prison and had to acknowledge the ribald comments of inmates before embarking on an official visit to a hospital. Being royal certainly does involve submitting to a bizarre range of public appearances. Sometimes it really is just like a children's party. Crowds of overexcited onlookers, sports personalities, clowns, cartoon characters. The role demands considerable versatility, as well as polished performance skills. When on form, Fergie seemed more than equal to the challenge, but more often she never quite seemed to find the right tone, the right level of involvement. At times, her enthusiasm led her into picking the wrong event, inviting ridicule and even contempt. Far more popular abroad, where her feisty, independent manner was admired, at home she was considered over the top. The press had now definitely singled her out as the royal to put the knife in. Andrew wasn't around to help, so where were the advisors to assist a commoner through this public relations minefield?
There is no job description for people coming into the royal family. There's no job description for a princess. There was no job description for Mark Phillips when he came into the royal family, or Anthony Armstrong-Jones when he came in. And we all know what happened to those marriages. And I think with the Duchess of York, if somebody had said to her, well, don't you think you might do this, you might do that, you might curtail things? And I believe the one person who could have done it would have been the Princess Royal, because she was born royal, she's never been anything other than royal, and she knows exactly how to behave at all times.
But sometimes she did manage to turn her enthusiasm to good effect. All the bad publicity her love of skiing had received ignored her valuable support for the Combined Services Winter Sports Association and her particular interest in their disabled skiing program. She was a major factor in this charity's fundraising, and despite being pregnant with Eugenie and unable to ski herself, she made the trip up the mountain to watch the races. But first, an unscheduled stop to sign a plaster cast.
I'll draw one of mine little skiers.
This is a real bonus.
Such frequent acts of impulse created havoc with the carefully timed official schedules, causing irritation and resentment amongst royal staff, used to a more ordered way of doing things. But despite all her gaffes and upsets, such spontaneity revealed a warm heart.
There we are. Please, madam. Please, madam.
The association organises many events, and here at Megève in the French Alps, there were the full range of races, including the slalom for disabled skiers. At the final prize giving, Fergie's role as president became more formal, including, much to her amusement, the provision of an exotically coloured throne. As usual, her relaxed manner and humour cut through the stagey setup of the presentation ceremony. Never at a loss for words, she would always rise to the occasion when an off-the-cuff speech was called for.
I'm not going to sing a song, and I haven't prepared a speech, but I just am so pleased to be here today. I mean, it's just wonderful. I mean, it's not very much snow, and I think you've done a fantastic job.
But her main charity interest was far from the glamorous environment of the ski slopes. Motor neurone disease was little publicised before Fergie took up the cause. As yet incurable, the disease leads to total incapacity and is often fatal. On a visit to a group of people with the disease in Australia, her sincerity and determination to be their voice was very obvious.
Hi, Johnny. Nice to see you. Yeah, you've got to keep strong. We're on our way to find a cure for it. It's very difficult, isn't it? Very difficult. She's going. It's anything I can do. I'm shouting about it, so I'll just keep shouting, Johnny. Okay? Yeah, I'm going to need a throat for you, Johnny. Because we've just got to keep on fighting. That's what we've got to do. And as I said to Rose, you know, we're gonna knock it on the head one day. But I think people are beginning to realise that when I get up and make a speech now, I normally mention it. So people are beginning to connect the two. So they are beginning to start, you know, because I find that when I start talking about it, they say, what is motor neurone disease? When you're feeling isolated and alone, I haven't forgotten you, and I'm out there fighting for you. So we're going to get there. We've just got to keep going.
But such work got little press coverage. This was due both to media bias and also the unphotogenic nature of the causes involved.
I feel she hasn't had a lot of the credit she deserves for her charity work because unlike the Princess of Wales, she's not involved with cute little babies who look gorgeous and snuggly and cuddly. They may be dying of AIDS, but it doesn't look like it when you see them in the pictures. The Duchess is involved with people, paralysed people suffering from motor neurone disease. I mean, the Motor Neurone Disease Association is probably her main charity. And these people don't make pretty pictures, but yet she does some magnificent work with them. I remember in Australia, we went to visit a clinic where there are a lot of people in wheelchairs, and one of the men there was at such an advanced stage he could no longer speak, and he felt so frustrated at not being able to talk to her when she came round to sit with him that he began to cry. And she held his hand and she said, "Don't worry, I'll be your voice, and I'll make the world listen to us. I'll keep on shouting and telling them until, you know, they listen to us and we find a cure." And it was magnificent stuff. And there was a television crew there practically in tears. They were all so moved. Everybody in the room was so moved. And a lot of newspaper photographers. And they all said, "Oh, we can't use that. That's too upsetting for the breakfast tables of Britain." They wouldn't use the pictures. They said, "Oh, no, the man doesn't look very good and, you know, it's not nice." And so she has that problem repeatedly.
The press always seemed far more interested in making unfair comparisons between Fergie and the Princess of Wales's appearance. She was portrayed as a laughable contrast to the tall, elegant Diana, a dumpy figure of fun who liked flashy colours and over-the-top outfits that seemed totally unsuitable. She just didn't conform to the stereotyped dress code of a royal family judged for its shows of restraint and good taste. In her previous life, clothes had never been a priority, and high fashion had always bored her. Such an individual mode of dressing could have worked, just as the Queen Mother's unique style became part of her public success. But Fergie's vibrancy grated. She just seemed too theatrical, and as ever, she was facing a hostile press. Her whole appearance became a constant target for ridicule. She was also up against some stiff competition in Diana, but the image-conscious Princess of Wales had known exactly where to go for good advice.
I mean, Princess Diana did have the people at Vogue to help her. And just as I was saying, there are no royal lessons, and perhaps somebody should have drafted, probably not the same people, but some other people as well versed in fashion to help the Duchess of York. It's not that she doesn't have a good eye or a sense of style. It's just that different things photograph differently. Different things are suitable for different things. There are problems when you get out of a car and the world's press is waiting, just waiting to take a photograph. There are problems when you've got to look sort of elegant for hours at a time so things shouldn't crease. Things like putting sort of LA at the back of a hat was probably meant to be very sweet to the people of LA, but of course was immediately pounced on by the sort of style experts here as being very déclassé. I think that the Duchess of York's very lively and buoyant and thinks that life should have a funny and a witty and amusing side. And I think that the establishment and the fashion establishment wants fashion taken terribly seriously and perhaps didn't agree with her ideas.
The popular press didn't seem to agree with any of her ideas. They swarmed around her, ready to catch any unguarded moment. No matter what she did or how she looked, the story was always a negative one.
In some ways, the press perhaps have been rather difficult when it came to Sarah, because I think the Duchess of York came along. She was so different from the Princess of Wales. I think the press were so terribly sizist, you know, so that every time she left the house, she must have felt, oh, I look the wrong size, I am, you know. They criticise her fashion sense. They criticise everything about her. I think that it's very difficult to have an image when you're not sure perhaps what your own image is, and perhaps you're not obsessed by it as some people in the limelight are.
Pregnancy proved particularly difficult, a time when choosing clothes for public view became even more of a nightmare, and often looked as much. Both times she expanded to alarming proportions with a huge accompanying weight gain. Even afterwards, she found this extra weight difficult to shift. and the tabloids pilloried her unmercifully. Such unrelenting personal comment was difficult for anyone to cope with, and she took it badly.
She had figure problems, figure faults that got publicised heavily, and that kind of thing makes any woman terribly embarrassed and upset. And I think nobody realises how upset she used to get and how she used to sit at home and cry about the cruel things that were written in newspapers. And people thought she was a figure of fun, and because she wasn't so close to the throne, they thought that they could more or less say whatever they liked about her in the press. I mean, you wouldn't say such things about Diana, not only because she's slim and gorgeous, but because she is right up there, you know, the next Queen of England, and a bit of a sacred cow. And editors tread very warily around Diana. But Fergie, well, she's never going to be queen. She's way down the pecking order. And so I think they decided that once they could get away with it, they kept doing it. And she didn't have the clout or the influence to get it stopped. It's very difficult to stop things like that. So all these freebie Fergie, you know, fun-loving Fergie, all the other ones, you know, the Duchess of Pork, etc., all these names became gospel.
Andrew, of course, wasn't around much to offer advice or support against this press onslaught. His naval commitments frequently took him away, leaving his wife to face the music alone. But would this freewheeling, self-centred prince have really understood her problems anyway? What kind of a man is he?
Spoiled, difficult, but charming, very naive, and very immature compared to the other men that Sarah's known in her life. But I think, you know, he has got some guts in him, and I just think if he just sat down and you know, considered that there are other people in the world besides him, you know, his life's going to be a lot happier. I think he has to stand up to his father, which is difficult, and he has to communicate with his mother. I mean, life hasn't been a bowl of roses for him. It's been very protected, and that hasn't really prepared him for the rigours of everyday life. I'm not talking about his life in the Navy, I'm talking about emotionally. He's immature.
I think most people, when they meet Prince Andrew for the first time, they think he's a very physical person, which he is. He appears to rush at you. If you go into a room and you're being presented to him, you know, you normally give a neck bow when you meet a member of the royal family. He holds his hand out, and he's aggressive, almost like an American. Americans are quite aggressive when you first meet them. They appear to be as if they're trying to dominate you, and he does this. He also shouts. He appears to bark quite a lot, as his father does, whereas Charles and Edward are extremely quietly spoken and a little bit retiring, quite reticent, I suppose. They're very reserved. He is not in the least bit reserved. He's very exuberant, very high-spirited.
Andrew has also been called arrogant, too aware of his own position. He often lacks patience, particularly when people get in his line of view.
That way, somewhere over there. Come on. Not for your benefit, just please move.
Marriage did seem to broaden his outlook, but as one friend said, imagine what it's like being married to a man who's never eaten a Big Mac, been into a pub or been shopping in a supermarket.
The Windsor boys are not generous with their money because they haven't had to live like you or I have. They haven't had to go out into a pub or a supermarket, buy a round of drinks. They don't know the price of food, or they certainly don't know the price of clothes. Certainly don't know the price of women's clothes, although I'm sure Prince Charles has got quite a good idea by now because he must have seen enough bills. But they are not renowned for their generosity. And I don't think that's really an inherent Scottish meanness. I think it's really that they just have no idea what things cost.
As wife to a prince, Sarah suddenly had to look the part. Now in the public eye, it was expected that she maintain a smart, well-groomed appearance for every occasion, something that inevitably costs a considerable amount of money. Diana could draw on her allowance from the Duchy of Cornwall. Fergie had no such fund. By the end of the marriage, her overdraft was well into 6 figures. In the early days, the two sisters-in-law grew to be close friends. Both were commoners and both had married men who were the products of the same very unusual childhood.
I think there's a very real argument to support the theory that these boys will never, ever be able to have what is regarded as a normal relationship with their wives not what most people regard as a normal relationship with their wives, because of their relationship. They were brought up by nannies. They have the nanny mentality, and they're always looking for another nanny because they didn't have a mother in the real sense of the word. This is not to blame the Queen in any way. It's merely because she's had to be the head of state and act as Queen and head of the Commonwealth throughout the lives of her children. And I think it has affected the relationship that the boys have had with her, with the rest of the family, and with relationships that they've established outside.
The Queen herself feels very responsible for any new additions to the family. When she was first married, Prince Philip had also been away at sea for long periods, and she sympathised with her daughter-in-law's difficulties in trying to build a home life with an absent husband. It was a big send-off at Portsmouth Docks. The Queen was taking her one-year-old granddaughter for her first cruise on the Royal Yacht Britannia. Andrew, for once, was on leave from his own ship, so it was a chance for them to be together as a family. The Queen admired Fergie for maturing her most wayward son.
The Queen was very devoted to Sarah. At first she was fond of her because she had taken that playboy Prince Andrew. We've forgotten now that he was Randy Andy once upon a time. Now he looks like a very boring, sober family man, you know, in the suburbs. And she changed him. Sarah Ferguson changed him from being a problem prince into a nice, settled family man. So the Queen would love her for that. She liked her for what she is, which is a very charming person, but I mean, I hear all the time that the Queen goes over to Sunninghill Park for afternoon tea and to play with the children whom she adores.
To begin with, they seemed the perfect couple, besotted with each other and unashamedly tactile in public. Their family life appeared relaxed and open, despite the constant attentions of the press. Beatrice soon had to face the spotlight too, but she'd obviously inherited her mother's sociable disposition and was a natural for any photo call. On Mothering Sunday 1990, Andrew became father to a second daughter, and the first visitor at London's exclusive Portland Hospital was Beatrice, come to see her new 7-pound 1-ounce sister Eugenie. Another early visitor was Diana. The sisters-in-law had now managed to produce the perfect balance of boys and girls, royal cousins for a dynasty that seemed to be going from strength to strength. Fergie soon emerged as a radiant mum with a new baby. The Yorks' happiness seemed complete. For both of them, marriage had provided a strength and stability. For Fergie, this was something she'd craved ever since her own parents had split up when she was still a schoolgirl. The future seemed very rosy, but history was about to repeat itself. Not many months later, cracks began to appear in the fairy tale facade. Andrew's duties were still taking him away for long periods. For a naval flying officer, family matters have to take a back seat. Left at home, the loneliness of being a naval wife was beginning to take its toll, a situation only exacerbated by her growing isolation within the royal family. She was struggling with the mounting problems of trying to build a successful public role, while rumours were rife that she was finding support and even romance elsewhere. She needed help, and there was none around.
There's no charm school for princesses or duchesses. There's no one that sort of stands up and a guru that advises them. I mean, Fergie didn't have anyone like that, desperately needed someone, I think. She had the advice of her father, which sometimes wasn't the best advice, and her mother was away, and she had the advice of her friends who didn't really know. There was no one really to help her, no one that she respected enough to listen to. And I think this is probably one of the problems of people marrying into this family. There's no one to tell them what to do and what they can and can't do, because you can't, your former life just doesn't come into play when you marry into that family. You just cannot do any of the things that you did before.
Perhaps that had been her first mistake. Her refusal to forsake her skiing holidays ruffled feathers both inside and outside the palace. Horse riding was another interest she persisted in, but at least this pursuit fitted more easily with the royal family's own obsession with horses. But she can hardly be accused of not taking an interest in her husband's activities. She took on the challenge of learning how to fly, specifically to bring herself closer to him. As she said herself, "Flying is his life, and I want to be a part of his life." Not many wives would have carried their devotion to such lengths. Chameleon-like, she was willing to take on another's interests for the sake of a more understanding relationship. The effort was all there, and yet the marriage failed. Perhaps it was because she wasn't a typical Windsor woman.
The fact that she can go on places like abroad and do speeches in French and German, which the other Windsor women can't do. She's so different in a million different ways. She's more like an ordinary woman, career woman of today. And they are really like women of 100 years ago. And I think that sums up basically the problem.
There's no way that Fergie felt she would be beaten by the system, but I think in the end it did beat her. And I think you can't marry into that family and retain very much individuality, which is very sad because that's what we all like.
The pressures of an unhappy marriage were clearly beginning to show. For such an exuberant personality, she seemed uncharacteristically withdrawn and depressed.
I think she needed time on her own to think. Also, she was so stressed out. I mean, even the last time I saw her, which was last year, at the end of last year, she was so stressed, I couldn't believe it. She was really thin and pale, and she just didn't know what was happening. And then she had this terrible turmoil, and the announcement and the separation, and then the absolutely horrific press intrusion. And she just had to get away, else I think she would have burst.
When rumours of problems within the marriage began to leak out, the news hounds scented blood and went in for the kill.
And the report's true, Mum.
As ever, personal problems were suddenly considered public property. There was nowhere to hide.
It's just the media, basically, I think, you know, that has really destroyed Sarah's happiness, in a way. And when she's getting attacked from the outside by the press, the palace began to see that, you know, that she was very unpopular. Then she began perhaps to be getting attacked on the inside from the family or the palace, and that was the end for her. She couldn't cope with being attacked on all sides, and she just wanted to go away.
But the show must always go on. For generations, the ceremony and mystique of royalty has been carefully maintained. The myth is perpetuated that the royals are a world apart, something removed and unreachable. All the pomp and circumstance is just a part of representing stability and continuity, of giving the public what they want. A cleverly orchestrated management system creates this facade. Most of what the world is allowed to know about royal goings-on is channeled through an extremely reticent press office. In keeping with modern trends, isn't it time that the presentation of royal family matters is made more open?
The danger is then that the members of the royal family will be seen to be media fodder, rent-a-royal if you like, and the press office will be seen as a public relations office, which they're very anxious to avoid. They don't want to be seen as being in the public relations business. So at the moment, they have to handle essentially what is their main function, which is looking after the public duties of members of the royal family, but more and more, of course, in the last couple of years, they're being asked to handle also the private family affairs, the state of marriage of 3 of the Queen's children. I mean, because as you know, there's a constant spotlight, and there is constant speculation about the state of the marriage of the Prince of Wales and the Princess of Wales.
Prying eyes into her family's personal lives is a phenomenon the Queen finds difficult to understand. Like many of her subjects, the British monarch is typically restrained when it comes to inquiring about other people's difficulties. Keeping up appearances, no matter what happens, is a vital part of the royal family firm. As a mother, the Queen finds it difficult to face up to family problems.
The Queen will go to almost any lengths to avoid confrontation. She simply doesn't like confrontation with family business at all. She leaves most of that sort of thing to Prince Philip anyway, who doesn't avoid it. He doesn't mind confrontation at all. But the Queen will avoid it, and she is very likely, if somebody went up to her and said, look, don't you think it's time you had a word with Diana or with Sarah about the state of their marriage, she would be just as likely to say, I think it's time the corgis had a walk in the garden, and she would walk away, she'd walk away and leave it, and believe that it would have disappeared when she came back. She simply would not involve herself in any of the private squabbles, relationships of her family at all.
But with the Yorks' breakup coming so soon after Princess Anne's, the Queen now faces a possible threat to the future of the monarchy itself. The Prince and Princess of Wales are still together, but what if royalty ultimately proves to be a role you have to be born and bred for?
The difficulty is that in previous generations they would have married, they would have had arranged marriages. They would have married somebody from the European royal houses, and their brides would have known what to expect. They would have known the form, and had there been any private disagreements between them, these would have been kept strictly private and certainly wouldn't have been aired in public. They wouldn't have dreamed of making announcements to the press or going to the media in general. And I think this is the difficulty, that now they are having to look wider for their partners. They're marrying commoners, and it doesn't seem to work.
By the year 2000, Fergie, together with the Princess of Wales, could have been one of the main influences to take the royal family into the 21st century.
Aren't they? Thank you. That's good. Did you do that at school? Is that for me?
Yes, it's for you.
Oh, how wonderful. Big letter, isn't it?
Fergie seemed to have all the right attributes. But as it turned out, she possessed a stubbornly independent spirit that was just too much for the Windsors and the royal system.
They don't particularly want women like that in the family. They are too independent and free-willed for the palace. The palace wants somebody who's willing to be content with just, well, charity work can be very rewarding, very satisfying, but where is the talent that she's got being expressed if you just do charity work? You know, she wants to find her own avenues to express herself.
I don't think perhaps that Sarah Ferguson was the right type of woman, although it appeared to us she was, because she was too independent, too vibrant, too lively. I mean, if she'd been more subservient and sort of the little woman at home, there wouldn't have been so many problems, because she wouldn't have expected so much from the marriage. I think, but then obviously these boys are not attracted to those little women at home. So it's a dilemma there. Yes, they don't really meet enough of the right sort of woman, but then what is the right sort of woman? It's very difficult, I think, to be a prince of the royal blood and find the right woman.
It all began with great expectations. Outside this charmed circle is new territory. What will happen to the first female ex-royal? What does the future hold for Fergie?
Everything she does is going to be monitored by the press. She's always going to be an object of ridicule. And if she gets close to anyone, I think it's going to be very difficult for her to form another relationship. She is the mother of the Queen's grandchildren. So I think it's going to be very hard.